Go. Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is, this happens to a blank on names. Let me start over.
No worries.
Hello, everybody. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Garreth Blackwell. I met him at a conference a couple of months ago where we were talking about embodied faith in the context of art, and it was fascinating. I'm sure we'll have some conversation about that at some point in our time together today. So welcome, Garreth. And tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are and whatever you feel like is important for us to know.
All right. Yeah, my name is Garreth Blackwell. Currently in Richmond, Virginia. I've been here with my wife and kids for about 13 years now. Came here for some doctoral work in the arts at Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts. Stuck around to do some teaching. So prior to Richmond, I did some teaching as well at the University of Mississippi. I've been teaching design, arts entrepreneurship, and creative business practice for almost 17 years now. Um, Currently, I am working with the Maker Institute of Studio Art and Theology, which is a Christian arts organization. We have 16 fellows from around the world who come together into a hybrid program where we teach I guess, connection. We don't like to segment out theological ideas and artistic practice. We like to have a holistic view of our students so that we know that what they're doing in their faith is actually a part of what they're doing with their hands in the world as they make much of a world that God has made for His glory. So yeah, we've got our first class of students right now. We've been going through, and it's been fantastic so far.
So for people who may have had a very traditional upbringing and their families attended a church, and you bring them into something like this where art is this thing over here, it's the windows in the sanctuary, or it's the music the choir sings. But as far as it goes, I'm not the artist. It doesn't really involve me in anything. So how do you take that kind of fragmented context that many people in the church experience and bring that together as something holistic?
Well, I think the first place that we really start is if we have a right understanding of what Scripture teaches us about sin. It says that what sin does is it has broken the world apart, right? In some places in Scripture, it says that the world actually groans, creation groans underneath the weight of it. So it is a condition that sits upon the world, and part of that condition is the fracturing of things that God has said shouldn't be put asunder. And so we do have a very fractured view of how the arts exist in our life. But if we take a step back and we just think through every moment of your day, right, the first thing that you probably realize from your day each morning is probably your phone alarm going off to tell you to wake up. And then you get out from under your sheets and you step onto a rug on your floor in a house that was built. You walk into your bathroom and pick up a toothbrush or get into the shower and make sure you have a towel over the rod. Then you go downstairs and you get food out of packaging to cook in pans. We haven't even made it through the first 30 minutes of our day, and we've already come into contact with a huge amount of art and design that we couldn't have our day without. The phone that woke you up was made by hands with intentional purpose and a reason for it to exist. You walked into a bathroom in part of a house that was built so that you could use it well, so that it could kind of be a backdrop with your life, that it could enable what you're doing. You got into a shower that relies on a whole system of plumbing and civic engineering and design to make it work. We have an entire backdrop in all that we do that is art and design. And so the first place we have to get people to understand is the world is broken. So it feels fragmented because we don't see it holistically. So in some of our tasks that God has given us on earth is that as Christians, He said, you go out there and you take these things and start to put it back together. So making much of His world is not just seeing it, enjoying it, loving it, but also doing things with it. And art and design is a key component of doing things with the world He's given us.
So the debate, which is kind of perennial between being a theist and being an atheist, that debate, which is constantly being carried on, is really a function of this brokenness.
Yeah, it really is because at the end of the day, the theist and the atheist would agree through what I just said of the extent that art and design actually impacts our life. Where the disagreement would come is for what? To what end? For what purpose? Because most theists would say it's to a greater purpose, right? So we have our very traditional sort of philosophical categories of good, true, and beautiful, which are helpful to an extent, but are probably not as comprehensive as maybe the church uses them. Additionally, if you're to ask an atheist, like, well, what is the end of this? Well, it would just be for my individual flourishing. It would just be from, right? It would stop with me. But the theist view of it would say that art and design is actually something that isn't just meant for me, but it is a gift, like other gifts that God has given me, to be used in the world for other people's good and the glory of God.
In the world of leadership that I inhabit, and when I'm talking with people in the business world and organizational leaders, stuff like that, we often talk about how the context that we operate in organizationally in the world is very transactional. And I have been pushing back against that for a long time because I believe that our relationships should be transformational, and that from that
Mm.
transformation we build relationships of respect and trust and mutual accommodation and a mutual support, and that's where genuine community comes from, by being willing to engage with someone where our lives become enmeshed with one another. I see art as one of the means for that to happen. And how do you come at that sort of community building that art has a place in?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, not because the answer is hard, but because the answer is multifaceted. It's a difficult answer, not because it's one that doesn't have a clear answer, but because it's a large answer.
Yeah.
And one thing I would say is that if we look at kind of economic theory, especially if we're looking at kind of developmental economic theory, we see this sort of continuum in the world, right? So we say that the kind of first stage of economics was a very, commodity-driven economics. I lived on a bunch of land. I cut down trees. I have lumber. You need it. I exchange it for something you have that I need, right? So we're in commodity space there. Well, these commodities can then be turned into products, right? So the kind of typical example is I grew wheat. That's my commodity. Now I have a giant stone. I can grind it into flour. I've made a product. I can sell you flour. And because I've exerted more time and effort into that, I can sell it to you at a higher price than I would the same amount of wheat. Then we take that wheat and the flour and we say, oh, we're going to package it with a few other things. And now we have pancake mix or cake mix, right? So we've done another service to it and we've created another product. And then we take that same thing and we start a restaurant where we actually make pancakes or create cakes and sell those. So we have a service-based economy. Past that, then we say, well, what if we take these restaurants where they're selling pancakes and we put merchandise all over the wall and we have a specific type of decoration and we create an experience for you to come into, right? So we have a new formation of the economy into the experience economy. Well, after that, then it was, now what? We're giving people experiences where we're providing services so they don't have to deal with products and they've never touched a commodity in their life. What do we have? Well, what we have in that space is a transformation economy, an economy that says that during these experiences, we want you to actually come away different or changed,
Hmm.
right? So you think of even something as simple as go to a place like, Disney World or Disneyland, right? You have a kid that goes there. After their visit, they're going to be changed, right? They won't stop talking about it. They'll have the merchandise. They'll want to go back. There's a simple transformation that happens. All of those are based on a transaction, but each of those things rely on the fact that a transaction does not make a positive economic experience. So, to your point, a transactional way of looking at the world actually becomes very hollow very quickly for a lot of folks. And we feel that. So when we feel people, when we talk about things and hear people talking about like the dangers of capitalism, what they're talking about is the fact that it feels transactional and not transformational, not relational, right? So students get into a place when they go through art school where they say, how do I do something with this? How do I have a job? And they begin to think very transactional. So they say, I can do a thing and I can exchange that for money. It becomes an economic transaction that isn't really fulfilling. So the numbers coming out of art school is that you're going to have 10% or less of total art graduates who are still in the field after 4 years. That's a very quick drop off and a very large problem for a lot of schools of art. Now, what you have to understand then is we don't need to just teach high skill. That's not the only important thing because skill does not equal success. We know this. The entrance criteria and the excellence criteria of something will always be different. I could be 7'4" and my entrance criteria into the NBA would be excessive. They'd be like, yeah, sure, come. But if I couldn't dribble to save my life, if I tripped over my feet, if I couldn't shoot, my excellence criteria would be very, very low.
Right.
So we have this whole problem within the arts as well. So where we at the Maker Institute actually step in, we say there's an excellence criteria that actually can avoid the transactional feeling of the arts and get to a place where it becomes relational. So if you understand actually the foundational beliefs you have about the world and ultimate reality, and you understand what those mean, what you do, is going to become much more rich. It's not just going to be transactional. It's going to be relational because you will ultimately understand people are important. It's not just about getting a paycheck. The arts don't have to be primary in everything you do, and that you're a part of a larger world under a good God. All of those things push against the merely transactional nature of the arts to a more transformational, more relational sense of how it works. So it's multifaceted in how that plays out. But for the most part, we just have to push back against some of the caustic ideas in our culture since the industrialization of everything that says you are kind of a small factory and you need to churn something out to have value. That's not it at all. We provide value in a myriad ways that don't have just transactional value applied to them.
So it seems to me that what the artist needs to focus on is what is the difference this work of art going to make to someone or some group? What is the meaning? What is the meaning inherent in this that the person finds in the work of art, not what necessarily I find, because someone else may find something different, but to create something which causes someone to want to be engaged with that work of art. I mean, I'm thinking about stuff that I've seen and over the years, and I can look at that work of art all day. There's a lot of I lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I was a volunteer out at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, and it was, it was a moving place for me. I'd go out there, and it touched me because it gave me a context of understanding who I was, and as a volunteer, I did pressed into doing various duties, and one of the things I got to do was to give school groups a tour of the of the art. And I remember one time there's this large, very large landscape painting that had a lot of activity going on in it. And I sat, these are elementary age kids. I sat them down in front of it, and I said, I don't want you to say anything. I want you to just look at it. And I want you to look and find something that is interesting to you. And I let them look for about 2 minutes. And then I said, so who would like to come up and point out something that is interesting to you? And so I had 4 or 5 people, these kids, come up and do that. And teaching them to observe what's there and brought them into an experience of the art, which, just kind of running through the art in the museum, running through the galleries would not provide for them.
100%. And that's, if we take something like an interaction with a piece of art or the way that we look at it, most of us, even from the viewer side, do have a transactional view of the arts, right? We go into the museum, we just kind of look at it, we consume, then we go home, grab a burger somewhere on the way home and go about our day. But we don't think of it as a relational space
Right.
often. That's wrong on our part because exactly what you're saying is correct. When we take the time to observe and actually talk to it in the sense of like, oh, what is this that you're doing? What's happening here? What's going on? Having the same sort of conversation you might have in your head, like with a book or a movie, right? Um, it makes a bit more sense. But if we take it into human terms, if we move it out of simply the transactional object-based space, we move it into human terms. Um, let's say that there's a young person and they're going on a date and they think that this other person's fantastic and they get there and the whole night all they do is try to figure out exactly what the other person is going to say next. That'll be a nerve-wracking, horrible date. There will not be a second date, right?
Right.
Because if I'm trying to constantly just say, well, what are you going to say? What is it you want me to know? What are you not saying?
Right.
That's a weird way for humans to interact, right?
Right.
But instead, it's like this conversation where I bring something to the table, you bring something to the table, and in that we find a fantastic place to actually have a conversation, which means you could have a conversation with somebody with the same credentials, experience, knowledge, and expertise as me a week from now, and you could have a completely different conversation. But the conversation wouldn't be less valuable. It would just be different because that's how these things work.
Yeah.
When we look at arts in that way, it changes a lot of the experiences we have because now it's something we can come to. And it's the sort of thing where, here in Richmond, we have a fantastic museum in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. It's a destination museum for United States art museums, and it is amazing. There are paintings that I have gone in and seen for over a decade. There are sculptures I have seen for over a decade. And there are times I go in and I see them completely new because the things that I'm bringing into the conversation with that work of art are very different, right? So
Right.
if we only think of the transaction, if we only think of the economic function, if we only think of it as some like mystery for us to decode what was that painter thinking and I have to get it right, then we miss a lot of the joy of the arts and the beauty of them and just the reality of it, how they work as like large holding spaces for community. If we miss all of that, we miss a huge chunk of why it would even matter to teach people about art, or why we even care that people have it in their homes, or that they support artists, or that they become an artist.
So what you're saying, I believe, is that we really need to attend to the context of our lives and the context of the art as it's presented to us. And those contexts come together. And that's where I see that as a metaphor for our relationship to God. You know,
Mhm.
we're living in a context of a world that is highly complex. And if you believe in God, then God exists as this transcendent being that stands outside of all creation and yet is present in the creation. And so it's like God is a work of art that we're trying to curry up to and say, what is this being? What is this work of art? What is this? What is this that's coming at me? What is being presented to me? How do I understand this thing which is being presented to me? And and that's not true only true of the work of art or the true of God, but it's also true of each other. Who is this person that's presenting themselves to me? And I think this point in our development as human beings that we've missed, but is really the key to the future of our world is being able to be attentive to what is really in front of us.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier those kind of philosophical buckets of good, true, and beautiful, and how they're
Yeah,
not just watertight, right? They don't hold everything as much kind of gravitas as the church has given them over time. Um, But a better categorization that really gets to the point of what you're saying is there art that is dehumanizing or humanizing? Are
uh,
they things that lead to the flourishing of us as people, as society, as community, as Christians, as people worshiping God? Or are they things that just degrade, that bring us down? Now, with those categories, what's helpful is we always have to kind of be asking the question. We're in a very, very strong cultural moment right now where even the question comes up of what is a human, right? We're in an anthropological quandary of sorts, where a large number of people would say that humanity is pretty much self-defined. I can say whoever I am. And then the historic church is saying, well, humanity is defined through its relationship to Christ. Humanity is defined by its relationship to our Creator. Um, so within that space, the humanizing and dehumanizing, I think, is a lot easier because then I don't strip away the artist from the work that I go view in the museum or the gallery. The artist actually is a part of that work. Are they primary in terms of how you understand it? I don't know. Maybe sometimes. Is the art primary? Maybe sometimes. People approach it differently. But what I would say is that if you're only looking at the work of art, devoid of the person who made it, you're missing the point. Or if you're only looking at the person who made the art and somehow trying to psychoanalyze them through the brushstrokes or the lines, you're probably missing out as well. But it is a much more holistic understanding of the humanity that we all bring to a piece and the humanity that is brought out, hopefully, God willing, in a piece created by somebody. And I think there's a very fantastic conversation that can go on between an individual and a work of art if they look at it through those categories of is this humanizing or is it dehumanizing?
One of the purposes of my podcast that it keeps changing and I'm adapting to the things that are presented to me. Yeah, and uh, and back in the spring, I realized that I needed to have more artists on the podcast, and because you all bring a certain perspective, which those of us who are not traditional artists do not have, but need to understand and maybe acquire some of those gifts of observation. I'm going to call them gifts of observation,
I like that.
so that we can engage with one another, but engage with the world in a way that opens up opportunities that we wouldn't have if we just kind of mechanically went through our day.
Mhm. No, I think that's wonderful. I like the way you put that. Uh, observation. So one of the things that has been a part of my teaching for the last 17 years is what does it look like to actually have a creative process, right? Because when you get in art school, you get to a point where process is a big part of the conversation.
Yeah,
And sometimes when we talk about process, we can talk about it in a very linear way. This is step one, two, three, four, five, right? This is what I do for every project. And that's a part of it. But we can also look at process as a subtractive or reductive process, right? We're going from a general idea to something smaller to an object, right? So our process doesn't just move us through a linear timeline of steps. It also moves us through kind of, who was it? Like Michelangelo or Da Vinci said, I don't do sculpture. I just kind of pick away all the rock that shouldn't be there,
right,
right?
right,
Sort of that idea of like we take away all the stuff. Um, but within that creative process, we also have to understand that we have a really weird historical idea of how creativity happens. If you think about it, just think of like kind of pop cultural references, right? You're going through elementary school and you're learning about Benjamin Franklin, and you say Benjamin Franklin, and what's the picture in everybody's mind? He's holding this kite, he's got a key on it, it's up in the air, it gets struck by lightning. That's the way we view creativity. That lightning strike is that view of creativity. We have the picture of Isaac Newton sitting under the tree, and the apple falls on him, and suddenly he has this epiphany, right? It's like a bolt from God of like, here's an idea, it's now in your head, and that's just not the case. We see that creativity doesn't work that way. In
right,
fact, those two vignettes, they only happen because of a lifelong pursuit of something. Right? Isaac Newton doesn't happen upon the theory of gravity because he has an apple fall on his head. That's ridiculous. That may be a moment of just like huge impetus that something happens, but it's not what is going on. So when we grow up, we kind of get this wash over us that creativity is this weird sort of mystical, ritualistic weirdness that I can't be a part of. That's why you hear people say stuff like, I'm not creative. You're not creative. Have you ever gone to a buffet and assembled a meal?
yeah,
Creative. Have you ever customized a car on a car lot? You're not creative. Have you ever, X, Y, and Z, fill in the blanks, right? we put creativity on such a weird pedestal that we say, I don't do those things. Oh, well, what you don't do is paint. What you don't do is sculpt. What you don't do is come up with scientific theories. But that is not creativity in and of itself. So we have to sort of look at the world in a way that says, well, what does creativity look like? What does creativity look like? And a lot of times, what it looks like is making much of the world that God has given us. It really is saying, it took ingenuity and creativity for somebody to look at rocks and say, what if we like broke those open? Maybe we melted some of them down. Well, if we formed those things we melted into something, would that be strong? What if we mixed that with other melted down rocks and put them together? And what if we took those things? What if we built bridges and they could go over rivers and then we could sail around the world and we could discover things and we could go to the moon? All of that is based off of creativity. So whatever got the astronauts to be able to go up into space relied on a guy going, what happens when you melt this rock? It's all part of the process.
And I think our problem with creativity is not actually our problem with creativity is it's rather how we have been trained to think about work, which is rudimentary. It's repetitive. It's the model of the Model T factory. It still remains the model of how organizations function in many respects. Now they may do more teamwork than they used to, but there's still that sense of the mechanical reproduction of the same steps, and and the people who actually succeed in those environments are the ones who learn how to jumble all those steps up into something different and new, which is which to me is really interesting. The process is really interesting. It's when I was consulting, which I'm doing very little of that now, but when I was consulting, I would go in and I would have some initial conversations with an organization, and it was really clear from the start what the problems were, and a lot of it, putting it in our language here, was there was just not a lot of creativity being expressed because the form of the structure of the organization was in place, and that was sacrosanct, and we were not going to change. And so creativity didn't have a place there. And so the people who did well in those environments were people who were not creative, but very regimented and followed rules. Now, you take the people who are much more creative and much more willing to break rules, take them out of that, and you put them in another situation, and we're probably going to call them entrepreneurs because they're going to start things,
Right.
they're going to create things, or they decide, well, I'm not going to run this business anymore. I'm going to quit. I'm going to start painting, and then they
Mhm.
become a world-class painter, or a sculptor, or a potter, or a musician, or something. I mean, you know, I don't see myself in the way I'm about to describe it, but this is exactly what happened. I quit being a consultant, a coach, and that sort of thing, and I became a writer. Now, I didn't think of myself as a writer in the glorification of the writer. I'm not Hemingway. I didn't think of myself. I just thought I need to go write this book because I have something I want it to do for me. I wanted to go create the tool that helped me become the artist, and the artist really was, how do I interact with people? That's where my art is, and that worked.
Yeah, it's I have students who oftentimes like we talked about mistake what they make as creativity, right? So I make a product, therefore I'm creative. But I think it does get much more to the point you're talking about, which is creativity is an exploitation of a scene gap, right?
Oh yeah.
So if I'm, and that's in anything, right? Especially within the space of like business and entrepreneurship, it's saying I see a lack here and I know a way I could fill it. Um, so that could be combinatory, right? You could say, well, this service here and this one need to come together into something else. It could be reductive, where you say this actually needs to be broken into parts, or it could be completely brand new, right? Something else could come up out of your mind. All that is there, but also creativity within the arts. doesn't just have to be original, new, never seen before. And that tends to be kind of a thing that hamstrings us in our creativity because we also will conflate creativity and extreme originality as the same thing. If you,
Is there anything original?
uh, I would say, um, I can't fully say no,
Uh-huh.
but it is one of those things where there's not much original. Most of the things we look at as original, we probably should just say are new features, uh, new packaging,
It's,
something like that.
I would say it's derivative of our past experience.
It always is going to be, and I think some
Yeah,
of that, if it comes out of a creational mindset, right?
right.
We cannot create out of nothing, right? So originality in that respect is futile to even go after because I have to always use the pieces that I have been given, whatever that looks like. Even if I say I am the most original sculptor that's ever existed and the art world agrees with me, well, I've still used methods, materials, and inspiration from other folks. So there's only so much we can really talk about originality. Now, there are people that definitely hit that space, and you're like, this is very different than anything I've ever seen. Original, though, I think is a tougher hill to climb to really get somebody to say, yeah, that's original. That's a tough place to really get to. It's a hard spot to occupy.
Unless they're creating a material that never existed.
Right. I mean, we have some of the stuff, right? So you hear about the stories of NASA development with things that never happened, with ways that food could be preserved that had never happened. There is originality in kind of that respect. Um, But if you're shooting for originality as your work as a creative, it's going to be hard. Um, there is a hyper individualization that has to occur there because you do have to separate yourself from the continuum of history, of art practice, of art history, of materials and whatnot. It's tough to really claim originality.
So would that therefore mean that for the artists, they need to be thinking not just about themselves and their thing they're creating, but thinking about how this is going to be communicated to people that they don't know who are going to see this and they're going to engage with it and maybe they're going to buy it or maybe they're just going to look at it or maybe they're just going to walk by it, but they have to think about. I'm asking really. I'm asking. Are they thinking about how will other people see this?
Sometimes. And the reason I say sometimes is I think it's more about understanding that in a physical world where we are sensory beings, everything is going to have an effect, right? So I know what's going to have an effect. The best art schools will teach what an object can do. So it may be, what do these colors do? Do they bring something forward? Do they draw something back? Do they actually impact the way a viewer would understand this? Do they appear lighter or darker? All of these things are sort of the foundations and building blocks of good art practice. So I think it's less about how will someone take this, because there is some concern for audience, right? Um, but not necessarily kind of one to one. Instead, it is, I have concern for the object. I understand how the object exists and what effects it has within the real world, so I can understand how it will go forth from here. So think of it this way. If I have a child and my concern is, how is this child going to be seen by others? I will probably end up making somewhat of a monster of an adult. But if I say, I know what can make a child be respectful, kind, happy, intelligent, and I move towards those things, then they will go out into the world and they will be accepted well by people because I've focused on the thing itself and not just the reception.
Hmm.
So in that sense, yes, we do focus on how will this be received by somebody else, but we do it through the object itself.
Yeah, I get that. That's really cool. I like that very much because you don't have to be an artist to think about how am I communicating my offering,
Mhm.
whatever it may be, to the world. And I mean, one of my illustrations that I use often, using my circle of impact model, relationships and ideas and structure, and speak about it in terms of a problem. And the typical problem could be we're communicating with our client and we keep sending him email and he's not responding. And so the question is, what kind of problem do we have? Is it a relationship problem? Is it an idea problem? And we're not clear about what we're communicating, or is it a structure problem? Is how we're communicating is not working, or is it really a relationship problem where they don't like us and they're just ignoring us?
Right.
And the question is, which one is it? We have to decide. And let's just say it's a relationship problem, and the solution is not go knocking on the door and blasting the door open and saying, "Why aren't you answering my email?" The solution is, this is a very creative thing, is to say, go to them and say, we're going to change the structure of our communication with our clients. What kind of information would you like from us, and how would you like us to deliver that to you? And then what we're saying is, we respect you, but we want to be able to meet your needs. We want to be creative in actually meeting the expectations you have for us. And I can see how someone who is painting, who wants their paintings to be accepted in the public and to be purchased, and has to have some way of seeing that as a problem that has a solution somewhere in that relationship.
Yes, and that is the $1 million question in most art schools. Art education 200 years ago was one-on-one for the most part,
Uh-huh.
maybe one on 15, right? So we had very much the mentorship sort of model. So you had the master and the student. So, you take somebody like Rembrandt, and he had a studio, and he had painters under him who learned how to paint just like he painted from him. And that's the way this happened. And then they went on and they trained other students, and the arts continued. Now we carry this through, and now we have industrialization. We start to see the rise of college, not just in the number of colleges, but the number of students in colleges. And the art school really coming out of World War II, you see a glut of people coming in, and that mentor model is kind of unsustainable. So what we then start to have is a much more transactional education experience.
Right.
What we get is, here's some skills. You'll learn from some people who are doing it, and then you'll kind of figure it out. Well, you take that model 3 generations into the future, and what you get is people going, how do we do this? And the faculty goes, I don't know. I was never taught, because the mentorship model had a lot of assumption in it that there were people out there doing this stuff. And as we changed to an academic heavy model, what we started to see was more and more people who were less and less involved in the practice. So now you have students sitting here going, I really want to do this. I feel it's a part of me. I feel that this is a vocation that very much is a calling, as vocation actually means a true calling to do this, but I have no idea how to do it. Who can show me? So we've seen in the last 15, 20 years that universities have started springing up these things about entrepreneurship and business training and applied business for different types of students and different types of fields. And it's all because we don't understand why this matters in a larger context. So, classes I've taught in the past have very much been about, well, how do I make money as an artist? How do I have a career as an artist? How do I do this? And it really is about helping students understand that it's a giant bullseye with a lot of different points on it. And we have to understand all those points to navigate where on the bullseye we are in terms of finding clients or galleries or art buyers that want our stuff, right? It's much more about understanding the context of what we do than just the discrete tasks. If you are a solid artist, people will assume that your skills are very good. But what they will need is the relational, social kind of idea capital that allows you to actually connect with them. Because if you don't have that connection, nothing's going to come from it.
What you're describing is not a problem that's isolated to art.
Correct.
It is everywhere because the transactional model is that we go network at a business after hours event to collect, you know, cards, little names on addresses, business cards. And what I learned 30 years ago, maybe it was even longer ago, that doesn't work very well. All it does is have an initial interaction. And I think this is what I see is a real possibility for artists. And, and if it's something that actually you want for us to talk about with your people, I'd be glad to do this. But I have been teaching people how to network through introductions. And it goes simply, who do you know that you think I should know, and would you introduce us? And what I find is that when I'm introduced to someone, the credibility of the person making the introduction is paramount to the person who is receiving the introduction. And therefore, I have credibility because the person who's making the introduction is saying, I'm a credible person to the person who he's or she is introducing me to. And the entire Eddy Network ethos is built upon those introductions. And what I find is that the more you build on that, the more you find that you have a community and you have people who want to be attached to you. I mean, it's not a fan base. It's not a fan base. It's really a relationship base of people who care about your work, care about your art, and they want to find other people who they can share their love of your art with. And
Yes.
And that I think that's the way. I think that's the way of the future.
Yeah, I
And
had a professor who always said, you always hear that it's all about who you know. And he says, nothing about who you know, it's about who knows you.
yeah,
Because they will be, because we always hear about like word of mouth sort of stuff, right? Word of mouth is the best way to get new clients or new whatever, because you're going to have the people who are the best folks to support you. And there's a relative part of truth to that, right? But it relies on a lot of hope that those people are always just going to be spouting your fame. Um, but at the end of the day, it really is about who knows you because you only have a limited network. You can only know so many people.
that's right. That's exactly right. And it's and it's to me it's just the way I've always operated. When I began my consulting practice in the mid '90s, I had three people that were when we were moving to North Carolina. I had three people that I was introduced to, and I said to them, "Now that you know what I want to do, who do you think I should know? And would you introduce me?" And each of those guys gave me between 10 and 15 names and phone numbers. I called all those people, did the same thing, and I continue to do that. And it really works. And I think it can work for artists because when some like I'll have to take the background of this, but I have a stack of art over here waiting for me to hang in my house that I've moved into. And I can't wait because all of this art, I know the artist. And that matters to me as much as the work of art.
Yeah.
Because I like who they are. And I bought the art because I wanted to say to them, I like the work that you're doing. So how do we then tell other people about that? Well, you can say, well, Frank is a great sculptor. He's a potter and he's sculpting really interesting stuff. I think you would really like it. Can I introduce you? I mean, you want to go see him? He's just down the street. It's that kind of energy, which I think is in a church context, we call evangelism.
Mhm.
But it's not evangelism of simply ideas. It's
Right.
evangelism of life, which is we're sharing our life with someone else, and they're going to share their life with us, and then there are going to be some other people that come in and start sharing that together, and that's and from my perspective, that's why I see art is having such a significant role to play in this because the artist is describing things that are explaining something to other people that they don't have the words or the ideas to articulate.
Definitely. I think, to your point, in the book of Acts, talking about the early church, scripture says that they all gave according to the needs of other people, right?
Right.
We boil that down in a post-industrial society to a place where like, oh, so they must have meant like, some place to stay or some food or some money, right? And it's like, what about community? What about relationship? What about business introductions? What about, whatever else it is, right? The full understanding of the church is a holistic life. It's not just one that is based on transactional things like we've talked about. And so it's very important for all of that to be a part of that when we understand according to their needs. Our needs are many and varied, right? And the church is fantastic at that, or can be in its best ways. Um, but also, I really enjoy what you're saying about having art from people you know. My wife and I have probably 15 or 20 paintings in our house, and they're all from people we know. And we made it a rule where it's like we cannot buy art unless it's someone we know personally. And a lot of that is because it feels like we're surrounding ourselves in our home with our friends. But it also is something where if somebody comes down and sits at our table, there's a giant, like 4 foot by 4 foot painting. It's an abstract geometric painting that's beautiful. And invariably, because of the size of it and its proximity to the table, if you come for dinner, somebody will say, "What's that about?" And because I know the person who painted it, I can talk about it in a very real way, but I can also talk about it in the way we discussed earlier of like, well, what do you bring to the table in discussion? What do you see? How do you understand it? What is this doing to you? What are the effects it has conversation with people? Then it gets them to a much easier place where they can go, do they like make other work? Would they maybe want to sell something? Do they have smaller stuff? I'm just starting. I don't know about it. And it's like, yeah, I think they'd love for you to purchase something and bring it into your home and live with it because that's one of the most flattering things any artist could ever hear is that I want the work of your hands to such an extent that I want to live alongside of it in my home.
One of the it's actually two works of art that I purchased. And this is probably 8 years ago from a woman in an artist in Asheville, and she had painted scenes from old black and white snapshots of her grandfather on the family berry farm up in eastern Michigan.
Mm,
And one is a two-panel thing, it's about 8 feet long, of the field and of the house.
mm.
And the other is of her grandfather holding her cousin. And to me, that was about family. That's what I connected. And I told her, I said, listen, I know this is meaningful to you. And I know that you're giving this up to me because you know that I appreciate what you have painted here. I said, if you ever want it back, you can have it. And I may be giving them back to her now that she's gone through the crisis of the hurricane in Asheville. And so we'll see. I'm going to try to. I've talked to her about putting an art show together to sell some of her art down here in Winston-Salem.
Yeah,
That's what the friend of the artist can go do as a
100%.
way to support them.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at one of the processes and practices I lead through students through is like actually time management and figuring out what a weekly schedule looks like. So how can you support yourself? How can you make your work? How can you do all the other things? And what they find out is that if they're lucky, an artist can spend 40% of their time making work. More than likely, it's a quarter of the time. Because if they really want to be successful, they have so many streets to beat. They have so many things to do, so many other hats to wear in making a successful practice that you end up not being able to do a lot of the things you want to as much because you're focusing on talking to galleries, talking to potential clients, updating your website, lining up a photographer to shoot your work. That at some point you're like, I've gone 2 weeks and I haven't touched a paintbrush. I haven't touched my laptop. I haven't touched anything to sculpt with. And so the more that folks can understand that support in the artistic community is not just buying, but also helping other people know about their work that's out there, it's a huge help.
Yeah.
So the more that network can be leveraged, the better, because it can maybe, in the best sense, put a few hours a week back on the plate of the artist to be making in the studio.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. So let me ask you one last question.
Mhm.
And I love asking this question, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. What is your hope for um, art as an expression of faith in the future?
I think my hope is if we look at the historical trend of art within the church historically, you could really make a strong case. The church is the reason that art even exists today. The
Uh-huh.
reason we even have the museums we have is because of what the church was doing for a long, long time. Same can be said for libraries and hospitals and a number of other things. So the church has been an organization that's been very good at preserving the arts, but it also has been a bit hesitant in producing the arts, right? So we have spaces where we're very happy for the arts to exist. They're very safe spaces. So the liturgical arts are safe, right? So anybody who continues to make very strongly liturgical arts, we understand. But we start to get into things like, I don't know, abstract art or things that don't feel like a one-to-one connection to the, iconography or images that we feel comfortable with in the church. It becomes a bit more difficult. Now, you put that into any other context. What if we said the only clothing we feel comfortable with is liturgical vestments? So anybody who's wearing something else just makes us feel weird. But we don't think about that with something like clothing. Or if we said the only thing that would be okay is hymns that have been around for 2,000 years. And then we said, so any sort of music, even if it's very blatantly religious, is just going to be an icky area. We don't do that in music. We don't do that with clothing. We don't do that a lot of things, but within a lot of visual arts, we do have that uncomfortability. And so one thing I would love to see happen within the church and the arts is an understanding of objects. And I think through the lens of humanizing versus dehumanizing, I think the church can start to embrace that more because it's something we can see more easily. Because something that isn't what we might consider classically beautiful can be very humanizing because it can point to the need and the lack that we have that Christ fills. But something that's dehumanizing will never do that and should maybe never be welcomed as a work of art. So I would love to see the church start to embrace the arts, even in a lightly hesitant way, to say, I want to understand. I want to know because there are a huge amount of artists who are believers who feel somewhat disenfranchised by the church at large because the church just doesn't understand. Outside of that liturgical space for the arts, the church is very hesitant. They think that it can only be something for evil, not something for good. Yet we're very happy to change our decorations at every holiday, and those decorations have probably been made by the hand of an artist. Or we're very happy to get new family photos made, even though those photographers are doing the work of an artist, right? We're happy to go buy a new couch or a table, even though a designer's hands have touched those. We're happy to order things off of a website where the products and the websites have been made by artists and designers. So if we can start to understand this is not a thing contrary to God's world, but a thing that is a part of God's world, and we can understand how that works, that would be fantastic.
Okay, I have something more to ask you because I think what you have opened up is some of the limitations that churches have placed on themselves to be fully engaged with God's world or whatever you want to call it. And we attended this conference together, this conference with about body faith to the art of Edward Nippers,
Correct.
and his art is not really compatible with most churches.
Right.
Um, but his art, his theology of his art certainly is
Yeah.
at a very deep level. So this is the bigger question for me. because there we talked about this embodied faith, meaning we see ourselves as representations of the incarnation of Christ. And so we're embodying Christ in how we live, but it tends to either be either hyper intellectual or hyper emotional, and they're not brought together in some kind of way that it's holistic.
Mhm.
And what was interesting to me at that was that all the speakers were very versed on the theology of incarnation and embodiment, but they were not well versed on the philosophy and the science of embodiment through someone like Ian McGilchrist. See if I can get that. And seeing that and having had a little conversation with him about that, what I see is that there is a needing for a merger between science and faith, where it's not about the intellectual level of science and faith, but it's about the embodiment of our lives as human beings, where we recognize that there's something transcendent in the world that's taking place, and we are experiencing that as sensory beings. And that sensory being is like receiving messages. It's like a language, a nonverbal language that we receive that communicates to us about who we are. So earlier in our conversation, we talked about being present. Something is being present to us. That's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing something is present that can't be kind of reduced to an object or an idea, but it's something larger than that fills us up and changes us how we view ourselves, and that's the world. And I see that. I see that that's where art is a key to this. One of my other guests is a guy named Yelani Hallasmaa, who is a architect and philosopher in Finland, and he wrote a little book called the Eyes of the Skin. And his point was the eyes are the least dependable sensory organ, and the skin is the most. Hmm. I can't argue that one way or the other, but that's what he says, and I find it fascinating. And if we bring a kind of a theological view into that world, I think we have a way of expanding our presence and our sense of what is really going on in the world. And it will make the art that is created even more valuable as representations of what life is.
Yeah, I think so. To your point that churches have the church has probably put strange constraints that are not necessarily there. The New Testament speaks about that there are people who will say beyond Scripture, don't do this or don't do that, and the epistle writers actually call that the doctrine of Satan, right? They say it's actually not what God is saying when he says to go and make much of his world, to enjoy his creation, to live in the freedom of Christ. So I think it is good to sort of look at and explore, well, what are those constraints we placed on things that are not scriptural? And what are some constraints that scripture has placed on it that maybe we've ignored, right? So there's definitely that conversation. And I think it all starts with the subordination of all things under Christ, like scripture talks about. So if all those things fall under Christ and we see them in their proper size and scale, then we can start to say, oh, well, you're right. There probably is an identity problem within the arts where artists are tied up way too much with their own identity. So that's a problem. We need to deal with it. But that doesn't mean we throw out the arts entirely.
No, that's right.
We may actually, if we look at scripture, depend too heavily on what our eyes see and think that this is the only thing, even though scripture tells us that there's an unseen realm that is active in the world we live in, but we don't really understand it because we only look at what we can perceive as dull humans under the weight of the fall of creation. So we take all these things into account, then I think the arts are a fantastic space to explore so many things. And I think it is a wonderful space for the culmination of art and theology together, which is, a big reason why we started the Maker Institute, because we believe that this is a conversation that is only just starting in a real sense. And then you go into things like design and theology, that's a conversation that maybe hasn't even started yet. It's at its very beginning points. So there's a lot of work that can be done. And if the church vacates that space, then somebody else is going to have that conversation. And as the church should be doing anyway, we'll have to go and correct it and fix it and make it correct based on the scripture and the lordship of Christ. So why not be involved now? Why not start asking in the proper direction?
I agree. Well, to me, this is exciting, and I love what you're doing with the Maker Institute, and I wish you every success because you're going to
Thank you.
not just make, no, you're not making people. You're not just helping people do better at what they do, but you're also creating a context for them to take what they do and share it more broadly, which has an effect about that is really needed. And that's exciting to me. So
Yes.
anybody that you feel like I should be interviewing, introduce us because I'd love to have this conversation with more artists, as much to encourage them and appreciate them for who they are, because we need that. We need to celebrate their creativity and the contributions they make to the world.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Garrett, thank you very much for being here. I've enjoyed getting to know you better, and I need to figure out a way to come see you all in Richmond and see more of what you're doing there. And I look forward to doing it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed. I really do appreciate it.
And thank you all for watching. And please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.